Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talks in Class. I'm Jenna, and I'm here with a very special guest slash co-host today, my husband, Joe, the infamous Hubs.
Hey guys, I'm Joe.
This episode is actually going to come out on Friday the 13th, which is basically my husband's unofficial holiday. He was born on Friday the 13th, and I think that shaped every part of who he is today.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
So I don't usually have guests, but we're under the same roof, so I figured it would be easy enough. And I always think it's really interesting when we talk about things that we experienced growing up, because I'm a smack middle millennial born in 1987, and he is definitely much more of a Xennial. Is that what it's called?
I have no idea.
A Gen X, an old millennial.
Yeah, let's just call it what it is.
A far geriatric millennial born in 1982.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my childhood was in the 90s. I was alive in the 80s, but like barely. I don't really remember it. But your childhood was in the 80s.
I guess. I mean, a little bit of both.
But you remember a lot of things about the 80s.
Yes.
And I don't really. So when I think about childhood, it's all the 90s. Plus, I was an only child. Most of my friends, actually a lot of my friends did have older siblings, but I was an only child, so I wasn't exposed to a lot of Gen X things, and you had an older sister.
Mm-hmm.
So you were exposed to a lot of Gen X things.
Yeah.
So even though we're 5 years apart, it feels like we had completely different childhoods in a lot of ways when we talk about things, plus we just had very different interests as kids. So for today, in honor of Friday the 13th, and a Friday the 13th that lands in October, very special, we are going to talk about our favorite Halloween or general spooky season movies from when we were kids. So growing up, I wasn't really a scary movies person. Shouldn't come as much of a surprise, right? I was a Disney Barbie girl, American Girl dolls girl. It just wasn't my thing, but even though it wasn't, it still was such a part of my childhood, because I feel like it was just a mandatory requirement for any kid that grew up in the 90s or before to watch bad, scary movies at sleepovers and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And you watched them because you enjoyed them.
Yeah, absolutely.
From what age?
Pretty early on, because, I don't know, I come from a movie-loving family. We just always talk movies, and I was introduced to, like, classic movies at a young age. Like, King Kong was my favorite movie as a kid.
Which is very scary for a child to watch.
Yeah, but
not a scary movie, but scary for a child.
It had dinosaurs. It was, yeah, and we're talking the 1933 black and white King Kong. Mm-hmm. That was the first movie I remember ever really loving.
What was the first actual horror movie you remember seeing?
It might be the first movie on my list that we're going to talk about.
Okay, so we'll wait on that.
Okay.
For me, because I wasn't a big scary movie person, we were just watching these almost because it felt like we weren't supposed to watch them, and it was a sleepover thing. So it was pretty much whatever bad, old, cheesy horror movies we could get our hands on at the video store. They were always in the dollar section of the video store, like the cheap ones. And for some reason, the one that stands out in my mind from childhood, before I got into the ones that I enjoyed, some of which are on my list, is Prom Night. Mm-hmm. When is that from?
Early 80s.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I don't know why, but my friends and I loved to rent movies like that and watch them. So those were kind of my earliest memories of scary movies.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it was kind of a rite of passage for our generation, like watching movies late night on television, going to the video store, watching these movies at sleepovers. I feel like everyone kind of did that, right?
I wonder if kids still do that, because now everything is so algorithm based, and you can curate your viewing experience so specifically now. We didn't have options.
Yeah, when you rented a video at the video store, like, you were committed.
Yeah.
Like today, I'm sure if you're watching with your friends on Netflix or whatever, you're going to be like, the kids today will be like, oh, this is boring. Let's just click to something else.
And that's such a great point, because as you know, if I don't see something 5 times minimum, I may as well have never seen it. It does not stay in my mind. But when I was young, I would rent movies, and because you had a limited number of options because it was a physical thing, I would watch it multiple times before I took it back to the video store, and that probably is a big reason why I have such vivid memories of so much of these movies from when I was a kid, and current stuff, no idea.
Yeah.
We watched it a month ago, I don't even remember.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so with that said, let's get into our list. We both have our own list that we made separate of our top 5 Halloween season movies from childhood. So let's get into it. We're going to start with number 5. I'll go first.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is The Addams Family. We'll say the original Addams Family, but both the Addams Family movie and the Addams Family values are great. And one thing that I think about being a kid in the 90s is that we watched a lot of old TV shows from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, probably because of Nick at Night. But I remember watching The Addams Family, The Munsters. I watched all of those shows. So as a kid, when a movie would come out, like The Addams Family, I already had kind of a frame of reference, but then you added in like Christina Ricci and just this amazing cast. It's so 90s. And I loved it. I think it still holds up really well today.
Mm-hmm.
What thoughts do you have on the Addams Family movies?
Yeah, it's great. It's classic. It's genuinely funny, genuinely well written. I love the production design. It has a great score. Yeah, just really great. Love it.
I think that's another thing that I really appreciated about it is that, and also we talked about this recently because we recently watched the Brady Bunch movies.
Mm-hmm.
There were these kind of parody versions of old media that they made into movies in the 90s, like the Addams Family movies and the Brady Bunch movies. The Brady Bunch movies much more so in terms of parody, but they're genuinely funny and they're very clever and they're not silly kids humor.
Right.
They're actually funny even to watch as adults, but some of it when I watch now, like, it's not appropriate for children.
Yeah, you were there to not just entertain kids. You were making a movie for a larger audience.
That's so true. And I have no idea when I first saw this movie. I doubt I saw it in the theaters because I would have been too young.
Yeah, I didn't see that one. I didn't see the first one in theaters. The second one I did.
That's a good one. The second one's good.
Yeah.
But what this movie always makes me think of is the TV lineup that would happen around Halloween. And this is still a thing, I guess, if you have cable. But this is when this movie, I think, really entered like the zeitgeist and kind of became a millennial staple, is through things like 13 Nights of Halloween, and when you got all of these 90s movies that were resurfaced for these Halloween lineups, which I like.
Yeah.
All right, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is one of the first, I guess it would have been modern horror movies that I saw back when I was a kid. I think I saw it for the first time. My sister used to rent horror movies back then.
Of course.
I remember her renting this and like Beetlejuice and Pet Sematary.
Oh God.
Yeah, I saw that probably right around this time too. So yeah, it's how I was exposed to a lot of these movies, and A Nightmare on Elm Street in particular really stuck with me. And I was Freddy for Halloween that year.
And what year was that?
1989. So I was 7. I would have just turned 7. Still have a picture.
I've seen the picture.
You've seen the picture. And it looks just like the kid from Wedding Singer. Remember his like nephew is running around in the Freddy costume.
It's such an elaborate costume for those of you who obviously have not seen this photo. He has the mask, the little sweater, and a claw.
Yeah, the glove.
Imagine giving a 7-year-old child essentially a glove of weapons and sending them off to ring the doorbells of strangers' homes and beg for candy in 2023.
The picture I have is of me marching in the school parade.
Oh yeah, I forgot about school Halloween parades. Yeah, if you sent your child to school now, a 7-year-old, with a glove of knives, you would not only get a very stern phone call, but your kid would probably also be kicked out of school. Yeah. It's just not the same.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily a movie that really has an abundance of fall or autumn Halloween atmosphere.
Well, that's because it was filmed in California that they try to pass off as.
We'll get to Springwood, Ohio.
Ohio, yes.
But we'll get to another movie that was shot in Southern California that I will argue has an abundance of Halloween atmosphere.
I mean, I'm sure it can be done. A lot of things are made in
Definitely.
Southern California, but A Nightmare on Elm Street did not do it.
Yeah, no, it screams. Now that we live here, I see that it screams Southern California.
There are palm
But,
trees,
yeah.
visible palm trees. They stand, is that in that one where they stand on the Venice canals and they're supposed to be in Ohio?
Yes. Well, the Ohio thing, look, you don't want to get into that.
No,
in
I
this
don't.
podcast. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm always looking for an excuse to watch A Nightmare on Elm Street. The whole series, really.
I actually could talk a lot about A Nightmare on Elm Street, which I don't think I had ever seen one of these movies properly before I met you. Probably bits and pieces, but I never had sat down and watched them. And I really do genuinely enjoy them. They're so creative.
Yeah.
And they're fun, even though they're scary, and there are some genuinely really scary moments, especially in that first one. They're still fun.
Yeah.
They still feel not like they're totally going to ruin your day.
Yeah. Not as trashy as something like Friday the 13th, which I love also.
Which I do not love.
But I think that's why I was so attracted to it as a kid, because there is so much imagination and there's these amazing practical special effects.
And speaking of being attracted to it as a kid, I mean, it's not a kid's movie, but there was certainly a lot of merchandising aimed at children, which is hilarious to think about now that they made like Freddy Krueger action figures for children. He is a child murderer, potentially like predator that was burned alive and now kills children. And they were like, let's make dolls for kids to buy.
Especially as the series went on, Freddy became this, this kind of mascot.
Yeah, mascot's a good word.
And that's really when I kind of became aware of him, because this was like the late 80s, around Nightmare 4 and 5 is when they started lightening him up and
a lot more jokes.
Yep, much funnier. By the time we get to Freddy's Dead, which I saw in theaters, it was in 3D, and my poor grandfather had to take me to that. And if you watch that movie, you see that they are very aware that now their target audience is kids.
Yes.
Like Freddy's Dead isn't a wildly inappropriate movie for a kid to see, in my opinion.
I'll take your word for it. All right, number 4. Speaking of Christina Ricci and 90s casts, my number 4 is Casper from, I think, 1995. A lot of movies came out in 1995, particularly movies starring 2 of my favorites, Christina Ricci and Devon Sawa. Pretty sure Now and Then was also 95, which both of them were in, and it is a fabulous movie. But we'll talk about Casper. We recently watched Casper, rewatched it last week. And as a kid, obviously, I loved the kids' elements of it. Like, the ghosts are silly, they make jokes. It has a very Disney Halloween feel to it. But as an adult, I can appreciate that it's really beautiful. I love their creepy old house. It's supposed to be set in Maine. And I remember when I saw this movie for the first time, everybody remembers their house. If you've seen it, it has this big, giant room where her Halloween party takes place with the spiral floor. And then 2 years later, when the Backstreet Boys came out with their epic 6-minute-long music video for Everybody, Backstreet's Back, where they transform into the Universal Monsters and have a dance party, I remember thinking, that is the Casper house. It's got to be the same house. It has the same spiral design on the floor, and it looked the same. So I finally got around to Googling it a couple days ago, and it's the same house. It's actually in Canada somewhere. And I don't know, I guess the Backstreet Boys saw that and were like, that's where our Thriller knockoff music video needs to take place.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this before we rewatched this. I was making my list, and I was thinking that a central plot point in this movie that is very much for children. I mean, you cannot argue that this was not 100% a kid's movie. A central plot point that literally is necessary to move the movie forward is that the bad guy ghosts get drunk, and they take Christina Ricci's father with them to get drunk, and he dies and becomes a ghost, and then Christina Ricci is obviously very sad, and Casper, instead of bringing himself back to life, selflessly decides to give the little potion, only enough for one ghost to come back to life in the machine. He decides to give that to Kat's dad, Christina Ricci's dad, and then that's how he is granted the ability to come back as Devin Sawa in the most epic final scene of any movie that any mid-millennial girl ever saw. I mean, if you're a millennial of a certain age, you vividly remember the feeling of watching that cartoon ghost suddenly become Devin Sawa. It was like, and then he says, "Can I keep you?"
Which is kind of weird.
Yeah, what does that mean? That's creepy. Can I keep?
I don't know.
She's a stray cat.
Yeah.
Maybe because the house is empty and then they come in and they're like, I don't know. I don't know what it means. He thinks that she's his pet. What were your thoughts on it, rewatching it? Because you're a tough critic, especially when it comes to children's movies. You just don't like things that are very cheesy.
Well, I don't like things that pander too much.
Yeah.
You know? I feel like a lot of kids' entertainment when we were younger, like Addams Family, like you didn't have to be a kid to enjoy it. You know, whereas I feel like as years went on, kids' entertainment is for kids.
Yeah, and
you know?
well, and we've talked about this so many times. When we were kids, we had to do stuff with our parents, and our parents were not as willing, I guess, as parents are now to just like sacrifice all of their happiness and entertainment. So they were like, you know, if we're going to make a kids movie, the parents are going to have to sit through this movie too because they have to take the kids. So we at least have to put something in it for the parents, which is why so many old Disney movies have really wildly inappropriate innuendo jokes and things like that, which these movies also do. That just isn't a thing anymore. The 90s were different. I think that died in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right? Wouldn't you agree that visually Casper is really beautiful?
Yeah, no, I thought it was pretty well done. I had definitely seen it before, but probably not since around when it came out. But yeah, I was even noticing like names in the opening credits. I was like, oh, okay, just names I knew. Like James Horner did the music, you know, he was like...
It has good music.
Yeah, he was James Cameron's go-to guy, and it was an Amblin movie, which was Spielberg's company,
and there are so many cameos that I mean, those went over my head when I was a kid because I don't think I knew who Rodney Dangerfield was.
Yeah.
But there's so many people that pop up.
The Crypt Keeper.
Yeah, the Crypt Keeper.
Kids would have no idea who the Crypt Keeper is today. Yeah. More on that in a bit.
Oh, geez. All right. With that, let's move it along to your number 4.
My number 4 is 1968's Night of the Living Dead. And again, kind of like Nightmare on Elm Street, not a movie that necessarily screams Halloween or fall, but I guess just another movie that I look for any excuse to revisit just because I love it so much. It's one of my favorite movies.
It's such a weird, like, do you have memories of watching that as a child? Because that doesn't scream something that I would want to watch as a kid, although you were a different kind of kid.
Yeah, I remember buying the VHS tape, you know, when I was a kid, and it was always easy to come by Night of the Living Dead because I've gone over this with you. There was like a, it's in the public domain.
Oh, right. Yes.
So, you know, VHS tapes were always very cheap, and like in the DVD days, you would always find it in like those like DVD bundles. You buy 50 movies.
Yeah.
Night of the Living Dead was always in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to me, it just kind of has this great spooky atmosphere, and I'm just always looking for a reason to rewatch Night of the Living Dead, and fall's a great time to do it to me.
I think I've only seen it once.
And you saw it under pretty unusual circumstances.
I think that's the only time I've ever seen it.
You want to get into that?
You can tell the story.
We saw Night of the Living Dead at the Museum of Modern Art.
Yes.
In New York.
Yes.
And it was a special screening. It was a digitally remastered scan of the movie, and George Romero, the late great George Romero, the director, was there, and he spoke a little bit, I think, after the screening.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was really cool.
That was cool.
Yeah.
Anytime you go to a special screening or a special anything in New York, like the crowd is so much fun. It was just, this is a very interesting group of people. But yeah, that was fun.
Yeah. I actually saw it also on the big screen at the Lowe's in Jersey City.
Oh, I love the Lowe's.
Which is a theater that's been there since, I don't know, the 20s?
Yeah, I mean, it looks
like
very 20s. A classic movie house.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And it still looks exactly like it did back then.
With an organist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so cool. I love that place. All right. Next up, what are we on? 3? So my number 3 is maybe a little controversial as a horror movie, but I'm going to lump it into the category. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, which is from 1992.
Yeah.
It's a horror movie. It's about vampire slaying. Considering that I was 5 when this movie came out, I'm not really sure how I became such a fan of this, but I still have the VHS at my mom's house and my friends, and I used to watch this all the time. It was probably because of what you were just talking about. It was probably one of those VHS tapes we found in the bargain bin at Walmart for cheap, and I thought the cover looked cool. So I was like, let's buy this. And then because you have a limited amount of movies to watch, because it was a physical item that you had to keep in your house, we just watched it over and over. And we watched it recently. I think it was last fall. You and I watched it. First of all, I had not realized how big of an impact this movie made on me because I haven't seen it in, I don't know, probably 20 years, 25 years. And it all just came flooding back to me. And it made me realize that how many things that my friends and I used to say, quote to each other, came from this movie. Like when she says, excuse much, rude or anything. Her friend.
Yep.
Or when she says, what a homeless. My friends and I used to say that stuff to each other all the time. And it completely had left my mind that it came from this movie. But it's so great. Such an iconic cast. And just so early 90s. Like some of those outfits are insane.
Yeah. I'm sure this was another one my sister rented because right around this time she was a huge 90210
I was just
fan.
going to say, this is so right up her alley.
She, Luke Perry, this wouldn't have gotten by her.
And she's 5 years older than you. So she would have been at the prime age to be the target audience for this type of movie. And I mean, it's just such a great 90s cast. It's so good. And I actually, considering how much I really genuinely still love this movie, I'm surprised that I never really got into the show. I shouldn't probably say that out loud because that's like a sin for a millennial my age.
Yeah.
And I love Sarah Michelle Gellar. I don't know why I didn't get into this show. It might be because I was just I don't know, because I like the movie so much. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was probably a little too young for the show.
That was a little before your time, I think.
Yeah. But I do remember many a sleepover is spent in my basement, my mom's basement, watching the Buffy VHS on the big, giant TV that sat on the floor that we called the big screen TV, and you couldn't sit too far from the side to the side or it would go black on the screen. It was always in our sleepover rotation.
All right. My number 3, I'm cheating a little bit because it's not just one movie. It's kind of a series of movies.
Okay.
Just the Universal classic monster movies in general.
Okay, well, that's very broad.
It is. But they were all sort of one thing to me because I don't know what happened in the early 90s, but all of a sudden there seemed to be this whole kind of renaissance or this whole renewed interest in Universal monsters. And they were all being re-released on VHS, and I bought all of them, and there were comic books and trading cards, and I'm not really sure what led to that, but they were just really easy to come by. So yeah, they became kind of go-to staples, like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy.
And when did because this wouldn't have been on my radar because I was like into Barbies and I was so young, but when was all of this happening?
This was probably like 1993.
Yeah, see, I was way too young. I was watching Nick Jr. or something at that time. But then later, I mean, my mind instantly went to Brendan Fraser, The Mummy. So maybe that was a trend that led to.
I mean, someone probably
like
at Universal Studios was probably like, "Why are we not exploiting, these licenses that we have?"
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it seemed like a thing that was happening, and they made probably a lot of lifelong fans by doing that. And yeah, I loved them as a kid, and I still go back to them all the time, and I feel like the fall is a great time to rewatch them.
Okay, but if you had to choose one, because this is a really that is cheating.
It is. Okay.
I thought you were gonna say like a whole series, like Nightmare on Elm Street, like
right,
series.
Right. No, this is like a whole.
These are different characters.
Yeah.
If you had to choose one.
This is a whole studio's catalog.
Exactly. Like that's cheating. That's like me saying my Disney movies are my favorite.
Then I'm gonna go with Frankenstein.
Really?
Yeah, that's my favorite. Dracula is my favorite character.
Say not Dracula?
But Frankenstein is my favorite movie. So that's the difference.
Okay. Can't say that I've ever seen it. Have I?
No.
With you? See what I mean? If I haven't seen it a million times, I might as well have never seen it.
Oh, we actually saw The Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh, we did.
We saw it at the Lowe's.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that one I have seen with a live organist.
Yep.
Yeah. Don't remember anything about it, but I remember the organist.
Yeah, great movie.
All right, I'll take your word for it. All right, we're on to number 2. My number 2, honestly, it was hard for me to decide between my number 2 and my number 1. They could easily flip-flop, and when I get to my number 1, it'll make a little bit more sense why. But I had to put that one at number 1, which means this one has to be number 2, and it is Scream, the 1996 classic, which I know you also love. Did you see Scream in theaters?
Did I see it in theaters? I saw it 5 times
Stop
in theaters.
It.
I saw it 5 times.
How old were you?
Like 14, 15.
Okay, well that
14.
makes sense because you have nothing else to do at that age. But 5 times?
Oh yeah. I mean, I had already obviously been, kind of this horror movie obsessed kid for many years. And by the time Scream came out, and most of those years, horror movies were not. They weren't
good.
Well, they were strange. They were more like cult movies. They weren't the kind of movies that teenagers were gonna run out to see.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
And Scream.
Kids would be more interested in them because they felt like they were doing something.
Sure.
Kind of rebellious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when Scream came out, it really felt like something fresh. And
it was a cultural reset.
Yeah.
When it came to horror movies, for sure.
Oh, definitely.
It totally changed
everything. And it
was
something that like other kids were talking about.
Right. It was in the mainstream pop culture. Yeah. What do you remember the first time you saw it in theaters?
Oh yeah.
What was it like? Was it like a rowdy?
Not at all.
Oh.
And I was looking forward to it because it was a new Wes Craven movie, and I was a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan. But there wasn't a lot of hype going into that first movie, not like you'd imagine.
Right, because at that time, horror movies were still considered like bad movies.
Yeah,
they weren't popular culture.
Right. And especially being a slasher movie, that was something that died out in the 80s. I remember thinking, Drew Barrymore was probably the lead of the movie.
Of course. She was on the poster.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm sure you know something about this because you know everything about movies, but explain to me how you put arguably like the biggest star in the movie all over the poster and then promote the movie as like this is a Drew Barrymore movie, clearly, and then kill her off within the first 10 minutes of the movie. Was this like, I can't imagine any studio now agreeing with that choice.
Well, from what I
very risky.
Understand, Drew was all set to star as the lead, as Sydney.
Oh.
She backed out for whatever reason. She said she wanted to switch roles. She wanted to play Casey, the opening victim.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if she thought, if it was her idea that it would be this great kind of psycho twist. And from what I understand, it sent the production like scrambling. Now we have to find a new lead for this movie. But it
wasn't like a conflict with another project. She just decided she wanted that character.
That's the story I've heard.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was 9 when this movie came out, so clearly I did not see it in the theater. I did attempt to sneak into some movies that were not age appropriate, but this would have been a far stretch. So I did not see this in theaters. I think the first time I saw this, I'm almost positive, was at my friend's birthday party, which would have been in early 1998. So it's a long time, but this came out at the end of 96, right? In December?
Yep.
So that kind of makes sense because back in the 90s, we're so spoiled now. We have instant access to everything. Back in the 90s, we had to wait. If you couldn't see a movie in the theater, like if you were too young to see it in the theater or you just missed it for some reason, you had to wait for it to come out in video. And that took months.
6 months.
6 months for it to come out in video. And then when it did come out in video, if you didn't buy it, which most of the time we didn't because it was expensive, especially if you hadn't seen it before, that was a risk. You had to rent it from the video store, and the new releases were like impossible to get. You would go in and there would be that whole shelf of Scream faces on the boxes, and then you'd pick up the box so hopeful with no movie behind it. Because they would put the box, for the children out there listening who are not familiar, when you'd go to a video store, they would put an empty case on the shelf, but then behind it were the actual available copies to rent. So you'd get faked out and you would think that they would have the movie, that they had the movie that you wanted, only to be devastated to pick up that box and realize there's nothing behind it. So by the time my little friends and I got our grubby little hands on a copy of Scream, it had been a year and 3 months since it had come out on video.
So Scream 2 was probably out.
I'm sure it was. Yeah, because so this would have been, I know the friend it was, her birthday's in March. So it was early 1998, which it was her, meant it was her 11th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And I still remember watching it. It was a sleepover birthday party, and we were in this room in her house that had like all windows. And there was TV, and then, the couch, and then pretty much the rest of the room was a lot of windows, and there wasn't a whole lot around there. It was like kind of woods. So we were all laying on the floor in our little sleeping bags watching it. And I remember being kind of confused by Scream because before, first of all, I was 11. So I had no understanding of like something being meta or, intelligent things like that. Mm-hmm. And my only point of reference for horror movies before that were kids' movies or things like Prom Night that were very unintelligent. I mean, there's nothing, they're not trying to make a statement. There's no intellectual thought process going into a movie like that. And I remember being kind of confused, like, is this a scary movie? Is this a teen movie? Is it a comedy? I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a joke.
It was funny, and it was like a party movie.
Yeah, party movie is a great way to describe it. Mm-hmm. And it started this whole wave of teen movies that also happened to be scary movies or thrillers. Like they were teen movies first, like The Faculty and that really bad movie with Katie Holmes, and Halloween H2O, which in my mind is literally a Scream movie. Mm-hmm. It's a Halloween movie. It's a Michael Myers movie. Mm-hmm. But when I think of Halloween H2O, I picture Josh Hartnett, and my mind goes to Ghostface, not Michael Myers. I'm convinced in my mind that it's a Scream movie, because Scream changed so much about how scary movies were. It made them popular.
I mean, Scream was a mixed blessing in a lot of ways. Like anything that is, hugely popular, it's going to be, ripped off and watered down. And yeah, I mean, some of those movies are better than others.
But then it gave us the brilliance that was Scary Movie.
Sure.
Which I appreciate very much because I love those movies.
Yeah.
All right, you're up.
Okay, number 2 is Creepshow.
Oh, God.
Which is another George Romero movie. He also did Night of the Living Dead. Creepshow is an anthology horror movie that came out in the early 80s. I didn't see it until the early 90s on Channel 11 around Halloween time when I was a kid. I remember a whole kind of wave of anthology horror happening around this time because I was a huge fan of Tales from the Crypt.
Right.
We had HBO.
Yeah, I did not. I was aware of it.
Yeah.
I remember people talking about it, but I still, to this day, really know nothing about it. I didn't have HBO growing up. I feel like... Actually, no, that's not true. I did later, but I don't know. I just didn't... I missed a lot of that stuff.
I was the Crypt Keeper for Halloween. I think when I was it was 5th grade, so I was 11. And the show was still only on HBO, so it was still this kind of dangerous thing.
Yeah, and I remember when we were kids, HBO was like... If you said you watched something on HBO, people would clutch their pearls. Yeah. Like, oh my God, I can't believe you let your child watch HBO. But we were fine with kids watching Freddy Krueger, but not HBO. No. That's where we draw the line. That's scandalous.
Not too much longer after that, Tales from the Crypt came to regular TV, and it was edited, and there was Tales from the Crypt Keeper, the cartoon.
That I remember.
And the Crypt Keeper became, in the mid to late 90s, he became a mascot the way Freddy was in the 80s.
Yeah.
And it's almost hard to imagine now because I think because of legal rights, Tales from the Crypt is really hard to track down. It's not on HBO Max, and you'd have to hunt down some old DVDs. But I would imagine if you're below a certain age, you would have no idea who the Crypt Keeper is. This is probably around the time of things like Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Which I was obsessed with.
Which I never really watched.
Teaser, I'm going to do a whole episode on Are You Afraid of the Dark because I love it so much. I've been making you rewatch it.
But getting back to Creepshow, that actually does take place on Halloween. And it's 5 stories with a wraparound story. And yeah, Stephen King wrote it. It's based on old horror comic books like Tales from the Crypt. And just, this one really does have kind of a Halloween type atmosphere.
Yeah. So. And I can't get through it because there are a couple of them that are very disturbing to me. I won't spoil it for anybody who might be interested, but
it's also, it has a very kind of comic book tone to it.
Yes,
so
it does.
It's not a very harsh horror movie.
No, it's just a couple visual things that I can't quite stomach. All right, are we on to our number 1 pick?
Yes.
My number 1 pick should come as no surprise given that I am a millennial basic white girl, and it is Hocus Pocus. Obviously. And this is why I said that it was a little difficult for me to determine my number 1 and my number 2 because Hocus Pocus is not really a scary movie. It's not a scary movie, but it is definitely a Halloween movie. Scream would have to be my first pick if we're talking about actual scary movies. But if we're talking about movies that make me think of Halloween or the Halloween season, Hocus Pocus has to be my number 1. Obviously.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about my list. I don't know how this movie became such a basic girl Halloween staple. I'm sure it was because of things like 13 Nights of Halloween and people just got so excited about it, but I genuinely loved this movie as a kid. It came out in 93, so I was 6. And I'm sure I saw it a couple years later on video, but I remember also seeing it on TV. So this was one that early on was on television, probably on the Disney Channel. And I loved it. I remember one year trying to come up with Sanderson sisters Halloween costumes with my friends, but we were trying to DIY them, and we just looked like really generic witches. There was nothing about it that said Sanderson sisters. I had like long, stringy brown hair trying to be Sarah Jessica Parker. There was nothing about it that was recognizable at all. But my favorite memory when it comes to Hocus Pocus was when I was probably 8 or 9. I had this babysitter. She was a really cool high school girl, and she would come to my house after school when my mom was still at work. And we were watching it one day. I still remember this so clearly, watching it on the little like tube TV. And a big part of the plot of this movie is that a virgin has to light this candle. Like, again, this is a kid's movie. It's made for children. And they're like, what's the lore we're going to tell about the Sanderson sisters? How are they going to be brought back? And they're like, I know. A virgin has to light. Like, you couldn't think of some other rule? But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, back then you would want teenagers maybe to be, to feel like they weren't being talked down to,
I guess.
And you just assume it would go over the kid's head.
But it's such a huge part of the movie. I mean, it's not referenced in passing. Like, they hammer it home. So I'm watching with my babysitter, and I was like, I didn't know what this meant. I needed to make sense of this story. So I asked her what it meant, and she just no nonsense told me. She did not try to sugarcoat it at all. She's like eating a Snickers bar, and I asked her, and she's like, it's someone who's never had sex before. And I was like, okay. And I don't remember anything after that. I guess I just went on with my life. But that's how I learned really what Hocus Pocus is about. Do you like this, or do you just humor me and watch it? Because I love it.
Yeah. It's one of those movies you have on and I'm kind of half paying attention. Because I know it's been on so many times, but I don't really remember too much of what you were just talking about.
Really?
I mean, a little bit.
You're usually pretty good at retaining details about movies.
Yeah. This one's not my favorite.
What do you not like about it? The musical numbers, the talking cat, the little girl. Laura Birch is good. She's a good child actor.
Sure. It has some good fall scenery and
it was
atmosphere.
shot in Salem. It's beautiful.
I like that. That stuff is all good. Nothing against it. It's just never been my thing.
We're gonna watch it tonight.
I'm sure we'll watch it many nights, and I guess I'll just have a glazed over look in my eye.
I need somebody to really do the detective work and figure out how and when this movie became like an internet meme associated with basic white girls around my age, because it really has become that, and it's had such a second life, as so many movies have, with movie lineups that are kind of curated for the holidays, and then also merchandising. We went to Spirit Halloween. There's a whole section of Hocus Pocus, not just costumes, but just stuff.
It's a great example of just a cult classic. I mean, a movie that was released into theaters and
probably did badly.
Oh, totally. And came and went. And then probably just was under the radar for years.
Yeah.
And then, at some point just blew up.
And then they made a sequel last year, which I did see, and I know that there were a lot of mixed reviews on it, but for everything that it was, I enjoyed it. It is what it is. Sure. It's Disney, and it was 2022, but this is just a classic. This is the quintessential 90s Halloween movie in my book. What's your number one?
This is no surprise to anybody. Number one, John Carpenter's Halloween.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what else could it be? You know, I was thinking, should I switch it up? I
was trying to think about what was missing from your list, and somehow this didn't even cross my mind, but obviously...
Yeah, of course.
This is your favorite.
Yeah. I mean, it is... I feel like at this point, I've probably seen this movie more than any movie ever. So at this point...
I've seen it a lot, too.
You have. In fact, the last 2 times we have watched this movie was in a theater. It was at the Roxy in Manhattan on Halloween night.
So they must do that every year, the Roxy and Tribeca.
Yeah, or at least they have the past 2 years.
And we have been there.
Yep, a lot of fun. And I feel like, if you've seen this movie as many times as I have, it's almost like a comfort movie. It's definitely a comfort movie.
Yeah.
You put that on, that music starts playing.
It's the music.
And and you feel, and it's not even, and I don't want to knock the movie because I love the movie, but it's not even about being scary. It's about just like, it's like slipping into a warm bath or something, hearing that music.
It really is like the perfect, and you know how I feel about movies being overdone and too long and just like get on with it. I just can't. I can't sit through a 3-hour movie with 20-minute fight scenes. Like, just get to the point. This to me is just a perfect movie in that it looks good. The characters are enough to kind of care when they die, but you don't have to go into this long backstory. Like, I don't care.
It's super economical in every way.
Yes, and then when Michael Myers shows up, there's bodies, and then it's over.
Yeah, and then we're out.
It's just done. There's no added garbage at the end to try to build up set up a sequel, which every movie has now. But I agree, the music is very comforting, and that's your influence, because I would have said that 5 years ago.
Sure.
But now, as soon as the temperature drops like 1 degree, the Carpenter music comes on in our house. You're like, it's time.
Yeah. And we talked about Nightmare on Elm Street, and it was shot, in around Hollywood, and Halloween was shot in, Pasadena. And at the time, watching it as a kid, I had no knowledge of that.
Right.
But still, even now, watching it, knowing you could spot palm trees, if you're really looking, it's still, when I watch it, I feel like it feels like chilly.
You buy it.
I agree. It feels like Halloween night, even though it was probably like 85 degrees when they were filming it.
Absolutely.
There's just something about that movie that it just...
Well, didn't they put like fake leaves on the ground to try to make it look
many.
No, not many.
It was a low budget movie.
Yeah.
So they had some, but you could see in shots, if you look across the street, there's no leaves.
Yeah. And all the leaves on the trees are green.
Perfectly green.
Right.
So it's just, I don't know, there's something magical about that movie.
Yeah, you're right. It does. Even if you know very well that it's Pasadena and that you're, like you said, there's a palm tree in the background of some shots, it still does. It's not like Nightmare on Elm Street where you're like, nothing about this is believable as anywhere except for Los Angeles. Yeah.
It's just, and just very relatable in a lot of ways. I don't know, like the kid Tommy, he has like comic books and there's just something, I don't know.
And as a teenager,
the teenagers, you can relate to the babysitters.
Yeah, totally. It's like such a quintessential American teen
Yeah.
experience. Babysitting and having boy problems. She's talking about the guy that she wants to go to the dance with, and her friend is like playing jokes on her, and you have that friend who just cares about her boyfriend, and then the friend who's like annoying, and you run into your dad when you're smoking. Like it's very...
All of these things would become horribly cliche
Yes.
in future movies, but still work really, really well in that first movie.
Yeah. All right. Well, you didn't talk about Friday the 13th, which is on your shirt.
No.
That didn't make the top 5?
It didn't make the top 5, but again, it's always a good time to watch Friday the 13th movies, too.
I disagree. We saw one in theater at the Alamo Drafthouse in Lower Manhattan last year.
Yes.
Which you claim is the best one.
It's one of the best ones.
Which one is it?
It's Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter.
With that epic dance
Crispin
scene.
Glover.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was not a good movie.
Corey Feldman's in it. It's a good one. If you like those kinds of movies, that's a good one to track down. But tonight, this is Friday the 13th, right? October 13th. Tonight, I'm going to see a Jason movie at the New Beverly Cinema. I'm going to see Jason X.
You enjoy that.
Yeah, not my favorite, but...
Really? The 10th one in the franchise is not your favorite?
No.
Shocking.
But,
does he go to space in this one?
He does.
Oh my god, I was joking.
Yeah, he goes to space. Yeah.
That's brutal.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
You watch that, I will watch Hocus Pocus.
Okay.
And eat Halloween candy.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us on this little chat about classic horror movies, if you can call them that. Thank you to my husband for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
I hope everybody enjoyed this. If you did enjoy this episode, I would so appreciate it if you would share it with somebody else who might enjoy it. And I will be back next week, so I will talk to you all then. Bye.
Trick or treat.